The morning I found my daughter scrubbing grease off the baseboards with a toothbrush, I knew something had gone very wrong. She didn't hear me come in. The little bell above the door had been taped down. My son-in-law's idea, apparently, so customers wouldn't startle his mother during her consultations at the counter. My daughter was on her hands and knees in the back hallway, her hair pulled into a messy bun, a bucket of brown water beside her. She was wearing her old college sweatshirt, the gray one with the cracked lettering, not because she wanted to, but because, as I'd later find out, she'd been told not to wear anything nice to work anymore. "You'll just ruin it," her mother-in-law had told her. I stood in the doorway for a long moment before she looked up. When she saw me, she started to cry. Not dramatically, not the kind of crying that comes with a story already prepared, just that quiet kind, the kind that's been building for weeks, waiting for someone safe to spill in front of. She pressed her palm over her mouth and shook her head like she was embarrassed about it. And that broke something open in me that I'm not sure ever fully closed again. I'm 63 years old. I worked 31 years as a regional operations manager for a mid-sized logistics company outside of Columbus, Ohio. I'm not a man who acts on impulse. I think things through. I make lists. My late wife used to tease me about it. Said I'd spend 45 minutes planning a trip to the grocery store. But standing in that hallway, watching my daughter cry into her hand while her bucket of dirty water sat cooling on the tile, I felt something shift inside me. A kind of cold, quiet fury, the kind that doesn't make noise, the kind that gets things done. Let me back up. 14 months before that morning, I had purchased a small bakery in Millbrook, Indiana, a town of about 11,000 people, 40 minutes south of Indianapolis. It wasn't a grand gesture. My daughter, Faye, had spent 6 years working in food service, first as a line cook, then as a pastry assistant at a hotel downtown. She had real talent. Anyone who ever tasted her lemon cream cake or her blueberry scones knew it immediately, but she'd been passed over for a head baker position twice. Once because the owner promoted his nephew, and once because the role was quietly eliminated after the hotel restructured. She was 31. She was tired. She told me once, over the phone, that she felt like she was running on a treadmill that someone else controlled. Her husband, Dwayne, worked in HVAC. He was fine. I'd never had a strong feeling about him either way. He wasn't warm, but he wasn't cruel. At least not that I'd seen. They'd been married 4 years, no kids yet. They lived in a duplex about 20 minutes from the bakery. The bakery itself was called Sweet Hollow. It had been operating for 11 years under a woman named Peggy, who was retiring to be closer to her grandchildren in Arizona. The space was about 1,400 square feet, cheerful yellow walls, a display case that ran the full length of the front counter, and a small seating area with 6 tables near the window. Peggy had a loyal customer base and a solid reputation. The asking price was $187,000. I used a portion of my retirement savings and a small business loan to purchase it outright. I put it in Faye's name. I was clear about that from the beginning. It was hers. Her name on the deed, her name on the business license, her name on the bank account. I helped her hire 2 part-time employees, a young woman named Terry and a retired school teacher named Al, who wanted something to keep him busy on weekdays. I helped her set up her POS system and her ordering accounts with the wholesale suppliers. I drove down 3 weekends in a row to help her paint, deep clean, and reorganize the storage shelves. The bakery reopened under Faye in early spring. The first 2 months were hard. They always are. But by month 3, she was clearing a small profit. By month 5, Sweet Hollow had become something of a local fixture again. People came in before church on Sundays. The high school ordered custom cakes for graduation. A food blogger from Indianapolis drove down and posted about her brown butter croissants. Things were moving. That's when Dwayne's mother arrived. Her name was Loretta. She lived in Terre Haute, about an hour and a half west. She was 68, widowed, and she had a very particular way of walking into a room. Shoulders back, eyes already scanning like she was doing an appraisal she hadn't been asked to do. Dwayne was her youngest and her favorite, which she made clear in ways that were never subtle. She'd visited the bakery once when it first opened and made a comment about the display case being cluttered. Faye had laughed it off. I hadn't thought much of it either. But somewhere around month 6, Loretta started coming around more frequently. At first it was weekends. Then it was 3 days a week. Then it was every day. Faye told me she was helping. That was the word she used when I asked. Helping. Loretta had worked as a bookkeeper for 20 years before she retired, she said, and she had opinions about how the financials should be organized. She also had opinions about the menu, the pricing, the hours, the seating arrangement, and the woman Faye had hired to do the early morning prep work. Within 2 months, Terry had quit. She told Faye she didn't feel comfortable with the other woman acting like she owned the place. Faye called me less during this period. When she did call, she sounded thin, tired in a way that went past the physical. I asked her directly once if everything was okay, and she said yes, just busy, and quickly changed the subject to ask about my garden. I should have pushed harder. That's the thing I sit with when I think about those months. I should have driven down without being invited. The morning I showed up and found her with a toothbrush. I had driven down without being invited. I'd had a feeling. The kind you can't explain to anyone who isn't a parent. The kind that just sits in your chest like a stone and won't dislodge no matter how many rational thoughts you stack on top of it. I'd told myself I was just passing through. I'd told myself I'd grab coffee and say hello, but really I'd been awake at 4 a.m. staring at the ceiling. And by 6 a.m., I was in the car. After Faye composed herself, she told me everything. Loretta had taken over the front counter. She'd rearranged the display case the way she wanted it. She had started making decisions about orders without consulting Faye, telling wholesale suppliers to change delivery windows, adjusting the standing order for specialty flour without telling anyone, canceling an order for a custom wedding cake because she'd decided the price Faye quoted was too low. She had installed herself as the de facto manager, and because she was Dwayne's mother and Dwayne didn't see anything wrong with it, Faye had found herself with fewer and fewer decisions left to make about her own business. She wasn't being paid a salary. Neither was Faye, actually. Loretta had suggested that Faye reinvest her own income back into the bakery for now, and somehow Faye had agreed to it, or had agreed enough not to say no, which in that house amounted to the same thing. The worst part, and this is the part that made my jaw tight in a way I had to consciously control, was the cash. Sweet Hollow had a decent walk-in business on weekends. People paid cash. Faye had gotten into the habit of leaving the weekend cash in the register drawer to use for Monday morning change. She'd done it for months with no issue, but in the 2 weeks before I arrived, 2 different weekend cash tallies had come up short, not by a small amount. The first time, $340 was missing. The second time, $210. Faye had mentioned it to Dwayne. He'd told her she must have miscounted. She didn't miscount. She knew she didn't miscount. But she was so worn down by that point that she'd almost convinced herself maybe she had. I sat in the back room with her for a long time that morning. I didn't say much. I listened. And when she was done talking, I asked her one question. Do you want your bakery back? She looked at me for a second like she wasn't sure she was allowed to say yes. Then she nodded. I told her I would handle it. I told her to keep coming to work, keep doing her job, smile at customers, and act like nothing had changed. I told her not to tell Dwayne I'd been there. I drove back to Columbus and I started making a list. The first thing I did was call my accountant. a man I'd worked with for over 2 decades, and I asked him to help me pull together every document related to the bakery purchase, the deed, the business license, the loan documentation, the operating account records, everything. He had most of it already because I'd used his office for the closing. Within 48 hours, I had a clean file. The second thing I did was look into the cash situation. I called Faye and very carefully, without alarming her, asked whether Sweet Hollow had a security camera inside. She said there was one. I'd installed it myself over the register during the second weekend I'd helped her set up. She'd forgotten about it. She wasn't sure if it still were. I asked her to check without making a show of it. She did. It was still recording, saving footage on a loop to a small SD card mounted behind the register casing. The footage hadn't been cleared because nobody had thought about it. I drove back down that Thursday. While Loretta was occupied with a customer near the front, I retrieved the SD card. I told Faye I was checking a loose wire on the mounting bracket. Loretta watched me for a moment from across the room with that appraising look she had, then turned back to the customer. The footage was not nothing. There were 4 separate instances over the previous 3 weeks of Loretta opening the register drawer, removing bills, and placing them in the front pocket of her cardigan. Not large amounts each time, but it added up. She was methodical about it. She waited until Faye was in the back. She moved quickly. She'd clearly done it before. I made copies of the relevant footage on 3 separate USB drives. I kept one. I gave one to my accountant. I put one in my fireproof safe at home. The third thing I had to address was the business structure itself. Faye's name was on everything. That was solid. But Loretta had been co-signing supplier correspondence and had, at some point, gotten herself added as a secondary contact on the business checking account, not as a signer. Faye was still the sole account holder, but as someone who received paper statements. It was a small access point, but it was one that shouldn't have existed. I called the bank directly. I explained that an unauthorized individual had been added to the account's mailing preferences without the account holder's knowledge. I had Faye send a written revocation request from her email, and we followed up with a phone call together. Within a week, Loretta's name was removed from everything. The fourth thing I did involved the Indiana State Department of Health. I had noticed on my first unannounced visit that the storage area where Faye kept her dry goods had some issues. Not catastrophic ones, but real ones. A bag of flour sitting directly on the floor rather than on a rack. Evidence of a small mouse intrusion in the back corner that hadn't been addressed. A hand-washing sink in the prep area that had a slow drain creating standing water. These were things Faye had flagged to Loretta weeks earlier and been brushed off. "It's fine," Loretta had said. "We've always done it this way." They hadn't always done it that way. Faye had always done it correctly. The violations had accumulated under Loretta's watch. I filed a complaint with the state health department, not anonymously, because I wanted it to be taken seriously. I filed it as a concerned third party who had observed conditions during a visit to the establishment. I described what I'd seen accurately. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't need to. An inspector from the district office came out 12 days later. I know this because Faye called me that evening, and she was crying again, but differently this time. She sounded almost startled by the shift in energy. The inspector had been thorough. She'd cited the flour storage, the standing water, and the rodent evidence. She'd given the bakery a conditional operating status pending corrective action within 30 days. She'd also, in the course of her visit, asked a few routine questions about who was responsible for managing the food handling practices. Loretta had tried to answer for Faye. The inspector had, with admirable firmness, directed her questions to the licensed owner, Faye, and only Faye. Loretta had not enjoyed that. After the inspector left, there had apparently been an argument. Loretta had said the inspection was a nuisance, that whoever filed the complaint was clearly targeting them, and that Faye should call the health department and explain it was a misunderstanding. Faye had told her she had no intention of doing that, and that the citations were accurate. and that they would be corrected. Dwayne had sided with his mother. Faye called me that night and asked me what she should do. I told her it was time. The next morning I drove to Millbrook. I went to the bakery before it opened. I had the key, Faye's spare, which she'd given me 14 months ago and never asked back. I let myself in, made coffee, and waited. Loretta arrived at 7:15. She had her own key, which Dwayne had cut for her without telling Faye. She walked in and found me sitting at one of the tables near the window with a cup of coffee and a manila folder on the table in front of me. She said, "What are you doing here?" I said, "I own this building. Technically, my daughter does. Same thing." She told me I had no right to be there at that hour, that the bakery didn't open until 8, and that she didn't appreciate people making themselves at home in someone else's business. I said, "Whose business is that exactly?" She didn't answer. I opened the folder. I had printed on clean paper clear still frames from the security camera footage, 12 images, each one showing Loretta at the register, removing cash, pocketing it, date and time stamps in the corner of each frame. I placed them on the table and slid the folder toward her. She looked at the images for a long time. Her face went through several things: surprise, then a kind of recalculation, then a tightening that I recognized as someone preparing to argue. I spoke before she could. I told her I'd already sent copies to my accountant. I told her the footage itself was preserved in multiple locations. I told her I'd spoken with a friend of mine who was a retired county prosecutor, which was true, and that what the footage documented was theft from a registered business, which under Indiana law carried potential felony charges depending on the cumulative amount. I told her the cumulative amount based on what I'd documented was approximately $820. Then I told her what I wanted. I wanted her key. I wanted her name removed as a contact for any supplier, vendor, or service provider related to Sweet Hollow. I wanted a written acknowledgement, not a legal document, just a signed letter, stating that she understood she had no ownership interest in, management authority over, or claim to the business or its assets. And I wanted her to be gone from the premises by the time the bakery opened that morning. I told her that if she cooperated, the footage stayed in a folder. I told her I had no interest in involving law enforcement if it wasn't necessary. I told her I was doing her a courtesy by having this conversation privately. She sat there for a moment. She was trying to figure out if I was bluffing. I was not bluffing. She took the key off her keyring, slowly with both hands, like she needed the deliberateness of it to keep herself composed. She placed it on the table. I pushed a single sheet of paper across to her, the acknowledgement letter I had drafted with my accountant's help, and a pen. She read it. She signed it. She didn't say another word. She picked up her purse, walked to the door, and left. I sat there for a moment after she was gone. The bakery was quiet. Morning light was starting to come through the front windows, falling across the display case, across the little chalkboard menu Faye had written in her careful handwriting. I could smell the cleaning products and old coffee and faint sweetness of yesterday's pastries, and I thought about my daughter on her hands and knees with that toothbrush, and I was glad I'd kept my voice even. Faye arrived at 7:45, 15 minutes before opening. She came through the back door the way she always did, calling out a hello before she even had her coat off. She stopped when she saw me. She looked at the table, the empty coffee cup, the closed folder. She said, "Is she gone?" I said, "She's gone." She stood there for a second, and then she walked over and hugged me, the way she used to when she was small, sudden, and with her whole weight in it. I held on. The bakery opened at 8 o'clock that morning. Terry came back 3 weeks later when Faye called to ask if she'd be willing to give it another try. She said yes without hesitation. Al had never left. The health citations were corrected within 10 days. New shelving units, a plumber to clear the drain, a pest control company that certified the space clean. The re-inspection came back clear. Dwayne was a harder problem, and I won't pretend otherwise. He and Faye went through a difficult stretch after his mother was removed. He was angry. He felt as he told Faye that his mother had been ambushed and that I had gone behind everyone's back. I did not particularly dispute the second part. He and I had one conversation on the phone that was tense and not especially productive. I told him his mother had stolen from his wife's business. He said that was a strong word for it. I told him the security footage didn't use words, just pictures, and that the pictures were clear. He came around, slowly and not without damage. But he came around. By the following spring he had, to his credit, acknowledged to Faye that he should have paid closer attention. He apologized. Whether that apology covered everything it needed to, I'll leave between them. What I can tell you is that Sweet Hollow is still open. Faye has added a second display case. She hired a full-time baker in January, a young man fresh out of culinary school who has a real feel for laminated doughs. She's been catering small events on weekends, office luncheons, baby showers, a retirement party at the VFW hall last month that she said went beautifully. She called me the night after that retirement party. She sounded the way she used to sound before all of this. Easy and a little tired in the good way. The way you get tired after a day that actually went right. She said, I forgot what it felt like to just enjoy it. I told her to hang on to that. I'm 63 years old, and I'd learned that most of the things worth protecting don't announce themselves loudly. They show up as small details. A daughter's voice going thin on the phone, a register that comes up short 2 weekends in a row, a toothbrush being used on a baseboard. You have to be paying attention. You have to be willing to drive 4 hours at 6 in the morning on a feeling you can't fully explain. And when someone takes what isn't theirs from someone you love, you have to be willing to sit down at a table with a folder and not raise your voice. That's the whole of it. That's what I did. And I'd do it again tomorrow without a second thought. I still think about that bucket of brown water sometimes. The way it just sat there on the tile next to my daughter, cooling. Nobody had even thought to dump it out. There's something that happens when you watch a person you love get slowly convinced that they deserve less than what they built. It doesn't happen all at once. That's what makes it so dangerous. It comes in small moves. A key cut without permission. A cash drawer left unmonitored. A voice that gets quieter week by week until the person using it can't quite remember what they used to sound like. Faye didn't lose her bakery in a dramatic moment. She lost it in 100 small moments where she told herself it was probably fine, that she was probably overreacting, that it was easier to let it go this time. I don't blame her for any of that. I've lived long enough to know that kindness and endurance are not weaknesses. They're real qualities, good ones, and the world needs them. But I also know that those qualities without something underneath them can be turned against you. What I needed my daughter to remember, what I hope she's carried with her since, is that doing right by people, the real kind, the kind that actually holds up, has to start with doing right by yourself. You can't protect what you've built if you keep unlocking the door for the people who are taking from you. What gave me any advantage in that situation wasn't anger. I want to be clear about that. Anger was there, yes, but I kept it behind the wheel, not in front of it. What actually moved things forward was thinking clearly when it would have been very easy not to, getting the SD card without drawing attention, calling the bank with the right language, filing the health complaint accurately without exaggeration, because exaggeration would have given Loretta a way out. Every step had to be done in the right order, and I had to be calm enough to think about the order. That's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. That protecting the people you love sometimes requires you to sit down, make a list, and trust the process even when you want to flip a table. And then there's the persistence of it. The driving, the early mornings, the follow-up calls, the second trip and the third trip. None of it was glamorous. None of it made for a good story in the moment, but that's what it takes. Not a single dramatic act, but a series of quiet, deliberate ones that accumulate into something that actually changes the situation. Loretta made choices. Those choices had consequences. That's not a mystery or a miracle. It's just how things tend to work when someone finally stops looking the other way and starts paying attention. Actions over time produce outcomes. The ones who think they can take without cost are usually counting on no one keeping score. I started keeping score. Faye called me last Sunday. The young baker she hired has figured out a focaccia that people are apparently driving 20 miles for. She sounded lighter than she has in years. That's what I worked for. Not the confrontation, not the folder, not any of it. Just that voice on the phone, sounding like herself again.